Thanks, Mark. Hi. Gee, it's nice to be home. It's very cold in Switzerland. You wake up in the morning and it's, I asked the lady where we stay. Every year we stay at the same hotel, and her name is Uta. And I asked Uta, what's the weather like today? And she says, the usual. And the usual is -7. So you make sure that you're well clad when you leave that hotel to go to the forum, to the Congress Center, where everything happens. It's about a 12-minute walk from where we stay every year. And this year was special for all kinds of reasons. But we'll get onto that in a little while. There were 3 main issues that came out. As you can imagine, the world today is a very scary place. We sit in South Africa and we kind of see the news headlines and we think that there's this chap, Putin, who's causing a bit of trouble in Central Europe. There's a lot more than that going on. We also have a look at the oil price and we start wondering what the implications of the oil price are going to be, and that clearly has an economic impact and one that is affecting us. I did a few numbers today. South Africa imports 500,000 barrels of oil a day. That works out at $100 a barrel to $50 million a day. Remember, the oil price is now halved, so South Africa pays $25 million a day for its oil instead of 50. Think of the impact that that has on this country. Think about, let alone the multiplier effect, just the cost of imports. And it's one of many countries in the world that are benefiting. While we were there, the European Union had their version of printing money called quantitative easing. That was heralded as a very significant move. That happened during the week of Davos. Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, was in Davos to tell us all about it. And then the other point, the one that I had my eyes open to, was something that it's kind of passed me by all the years because it was over there. CSR, CSI. In our country, we call it something like BE. It's called inclusive growth around the world. And inclusive growth has become a big issue for business, a big issue. And we'll get into that as we go forward in the presentation today. So, lots to tell you about, as always, because this is a 5-day event, and I'm giving you capped in 40 minutes. What is the World Economic Forum? For first-timers, it was started 45 years ago by this gentleman. His name is Klaus Schwab, the youngest ever professor at the Geneva University. He was 27 years old when he was professor there, and he is a double doctorate in mathematics and engineering, pretty smart guy. And he decided 45 years ago that he'd like to get people talking more. So he brought them together to this place, which looked very, very different now to what it was, which was a little mountain resort. Back in the 1800s, people in Europe were plagued by what we call TB. They called it consumption. So if you lived in London and you had all the smog, because remember there was no electricity then, London's in a bit of a bowl, the smog would eventually get into your lungs and mess up your lungs, and you'd get tuberculosis, and you needed to get it cleared in some way. If you were wealthy enough, you went to a place like Davos. So you had all these little sanatoria all over Davos, being the highest town in Europe, where people would come from all over to get their TB cleared. And of course, once electricity came in, there was less pollution, less TB, and they converted those into 3-star hotels for middle-grade skiing tourists. He saw this, did Klaus Schwab, as an opportunity to have a really nice conference. And he brought people from Europe together to this conference, and those 3-star hotels now charge 7-star prices. We paid 30,000 Rand in our little 3-star hotel for 6 nights. 5 grand a night. And I can assure you, it was not what you would expect to pay 5 grand a night for in South Africa. But that's Davos. That's the World Economic Forum, a place where people come together. Davos itself, that's a picture of the Congress Center, which over the years has expanded and is now a sight to behold. It's an incredible facility for a little town like that, funded primarily through this last week of January, when the world's rich and famous and powerful get together to talk about things, listen to each other, and set the global economic agenda. That's effectively what happens in Davos. That's what it looks like inside. Here's sessions where people are sitting listening. That's Klaus Schwab, the founder, and that's his wife, Hilda, who is herself quite a personality. She started the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. And the one thing that they're very proud of at the World Economic Forum is the fact that they've got aggressively involved in social entrepreneurship. Why is Davos a good place to have it? Well, imagine taking 2,500 of the most powerful people in the world. 1,700 of them are business leaders of the top 1,000 companies, chief executive or chairman, not both, either or. Those business leaders complemented by academics. This year there were 5 Nobel Prize winners, complemented by politicians. This year there were 44 heads of state, a record. The previous record was in 2009 when 38 heads of state were there. And you would have Benjamin Netanyahu and the head of state or the head of the Palestinian organization in the same area. So one side or the other might see it as a good opportunity to wipe one of them out. Clearly, if you want to change the world, you just nuke this place in the last week of January. So the Swiss know this. Davos is remote. It took us 11 hours, door to door, from London to get to our hotel in Davos. It's that remote, from London, not South Africa. And there's one road into town and one road out. And the Swiss put 5,000 soldiers in the Alps. So it's extremely secure. That's one of the appeals of this place. How it all works? Well, the famous like to be around the famous. I think, anyone recognize him? Okay, will.i.am. He was there this year. Angelina Jolie. Angelina Jolie. Last year, my wife's heartthrob. In fact, both her heartthrobs were sitting together. Matt Damon and Al Gore. Now, Matt Damon I can understand, but Al Gore, he's kind of expanded a little, but he's got the brain. And that's fortunately what she goes for. The idea is that there's a lot of one-on-one attendance, as you can see there, as a Buddhist monk. Faith leaders as well. Increasingly, that's a bigger part of the agenda. And there's quite a famous person, Marissa Mayer. She was in our media leaders in one of the groups. She came along and gave her 5 cents worth. She runs Yahoo, used to be at Google. And that's what it's about. If you get people who want to be around other people that they want to be around, you can get the best in the world. To get in costs about 600,000 Rand for a ticket. That's what a corporate membership costs. I worked out that if I'd had to pay every year, by now it would have been 7.5 million Rand in the hole. So that's a wonderful opportunity of just joining the media. You know, you get to go to places for free where other people have to pay a lot of money for. But it is you get the rich and famous, Bill and Melinda Gates, Charlize Theron, Muhammad Ali was there a couple of years ago. And this year, we had the privilege of listening to Andrea Bocelli. What they do is not just invite any tenor. They invited Bocelli, who you may be aware is one of the great tenors in the world, who's blind, who has a foundation which is eradicating blindness. They expect that by 2025 there will be no blind people on Earth. Interesting. Okay, so that's how it works. A couple of things that I just wanted to bring you up to date on before we go into what happened in 2015. The WEF prides itself on science in particular. As I said before, they have Nobel Prize winners there, but they also have heads of universities, and particularly on the science side. They're really cutting edge on that part. And they identified climate change as an issue, as a risk issue, many years before it became mainstream. Even before Al Gore got going on it, the WEF had already got it as a big problem. This year, a gentleman by the name of Bertrand Piccard was there. Bertrand Piccard is an adventurer, explorer. I met him, I facilitated a session in 2009 where he, Jane Goodall, the chimpanzee lady, and a guy called Mike Useem, who is with Wharton University in Philadelphia. He's an unusual leadership professor. He takes his students, his MBA students, to Everest, Base Camp Everest. And Bertrand Piccard is a third-generation adventurer. If you'd read any of the Tintin books, there was a Professor Calculus there. Well, his grandfather was the model for Professor Calculus. He was the guy who was always going down in the sea and up in the mountains, because Bertrand's grandfather went higher than any man alive, or before him, and lower. Bertrand himself, how I met him, was because he was in the news. He had a race with Richard Branson on circumnavigating the world in a hot air balloon, and he beat him. He beat Branson. Of course, everybody knew Branson came second, but not too many people knew that the Swiss man was first. He was back again this year on a subject that is very close, or should be very close, to all of our hearts, together with a few of the sponsors, including ABB, which is an engineering company from Switzerland. They have built a solar-powered aeroplane that is going around the world, jumping off in Abu Dhabi next week. A solar-powered aeroplane. So you say, well, what the hell happens at night? 5 nights and days they have to fly over the Pacific. There's nowhere to land in the Pacific. So it's a dangerous expedition, but there's no fuel, no petrol, no jet fuel or anything. They just go on solar power. And it's a breakthrough. They're hoping to achieve this breakthrough to say, look, it can be done. Solar power is a big story, renewable energy a big story, but we know that in South Africa it's one of our most successful programs in this country on climate change. Social media. Today, I guess many of you, I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands, but many of you will know Twitter or Facebook. Because of Davos, I've been on Twitter since 2008. That's like 6 years ago. It was very early on. Because they raised these things to the agenda earlier than anticipated. And this year, the thing that really was pushed hard was the story of inclusive growth. We sit in South Africa and we think, oh my goodness, politicians again, because of our past, we've got to do these things. It's not South Africa. And very much so. A lot of what came through this year reminded me that we're part of the world, and the world's grappling with the problems we're grappling with. We aren't unique in there's just about nothing that we're unique in. We think we are unique. We think we have a history that's different to everybody else's. Certainly our history is strange. It's strange, I think it's an interesting way of putting it. But there are challenges that the world is grappling with, which we are too. And that's what happened here at the 2015 meeting. As you can see, I really was there because this photograph says 2015. Those of you who've been here before, you'll see 2014, 2013. We've just got to keep updating it. Otherwise, Standard Bank gets cross. I can't sit at home watching it on the television. The main issue that came out this year was geopolitics. I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining this. The WEF employs 600 people. WEF, World Economic Forum. If you want to put something on your CV that will make you appealing to any company or country or government in the world, say you've spent a few years at the World Economic Forum, because they go around to universities and they pluck out the brightest. A bit like here in South Africa, what Discovery and Glencore do. Same kind of thing. They go and find the very, very best students around the world, put them into the World Economic Forum, give them a couple of years of researching. And what do they research? They research the problems. Because if you know the risks, you know how to deal with them. If you know how to deal with them, you can achieve what their credo is, which is to improve the state of the world. So these 600 bright young things are broken up into 80 different categories. In the 80 categories, they have access to the smartest and the leaders in those categories around the world. So social media might be one. And you would find in the social media category the guys from Google, perhaps Yahoo, the founder of Yahoo was at YouTube, rather, wasn't there this year, but he was there before. The founder of Tumblr was there this year. Marissa Mayer from Yahoo. And they would have access to these people and then assess the risks. And every year they come out with their top 5 risks. What are the things we've got to really watch out for? And they explain this to the business community, because if the business community knows what the risks are, they can apportion their resources accordingly. Similarly, as investors, we need to know what not to do. Warren Buffett says that. He says, my greatest skill is knowing where not to go. I'm good in parts, and I stick to the parts that I'm good at. And this year, for the first time, and I've been going there for 12 years, for the very first time, geopolitical risks appeared on the top 5 lists. They're always economic risks, always. Not only did they appear, but they are 3 of the top 5 on the risks that are facing the world right now. And the number 1 risk in the world is war between states. Now, this is extraordinary, because up until now, countries have been collaborating to sort out our collective problems. Climate change being the most obvious of it. You know, it's like smoking. Climate change is like smoking. You smoke a cigarette, you don't really feel it. But you know one day you're going to get emphysema and die before your time. And we're having this situation as well. Now, it's hard to tell a smoker to stop smoking in the same way as it's hard to tell a country to stop polluting. You need collective responsibility, collective risk. And we in South Africa have done a lot in that regard. The SKA project is a prime example of this. But where is this whole thing about war between states? Well, just to put it into perspective, for the first time, they invited, and there are many more people will go to the World Economic Forum. If they opened the doors, you'd probably get 100,000 people pitching there. Only 2,500 are allowed in. Okay, so it's very exclusive. Those 2,500 have got hangers-on, and there are other hangers-on who come there just to see the 2,500. Davos gets flooded by maybe 30,000, 40,000 people during this week, of which only 2,500, well, plus spouses, so call it 5,000 are allowed into the action area. But this year they invited military intelligence leaders from around the world for the first time. That gives you an indication of how important this is. What is the forum's strength is public-private partnerships, and what they've been trying to do this year is to actually highlight these new risks that have come onto the stage. And the biggest of these is Ukraine. Peter Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, sat in a little group that I was in. Because I've been going so many years, I'm now part of a thing called the International Media Council. Trevor Ngube from Mail and Guardian is also there from South Africa, and so is Bronwyn Nielsen from CNBC, the 3 of us, which is overrepresentation from our little part of the world. But we sit in there with the editor of The Economist, the editor of the Financial Times of London. Most of the major publications of the world are represented, about 60 people in all. So as they've all got different things to do at various times, when the presidents come to meet us, you have a relatively small group. With him, there were maybe 40 people there, which is the biggest I've ever seen. Because Ukraine is an interesting place right now, to say the least. Poroshenko arrived, and he put up a map. He said, you may not photograph this map, and he had a couple of heavies there to make sure we didn't. He said, but I will show you what's been going on in my country. 4 months ago, he said, Putin, he doesn't like him, agreed, as did the rebels, backed by Russia, that these are the boundaries that we will all work towards. Is a ceasefire, and for the next, until we can sort out the occupied territories and discuss it, this is where we will stay within these boundaries. We, as Ukraine, have stayed within the ceasefire boundaries. In the 4 months subsequent to that, the Russians have landed 9,500 troops, 600 tanks, and taken 550 square kilometers of our territory. He said, in addition to that, last week, we had our own Charlie Hebdo. Now, those of you who know Charlie Hebdo, it's a big story in Paris. People in France are walking around with badges which say, Je suis Charlie. They have badges now in Ukraine which say, Je suis, in the name of a city. Because from the occupied territory that the Russians are in, they sent a missile which hit a bus carrying 28 children. We don't hear about these things, well, not as much as we heard about Charlie Hebdo, because the Ukraine is not the place that's attracted a lot of international media. But the reality is, Ukraine is not on the brink of war, it is in war. There are, in his opinion, he says, we are defending not only Ukraine, we are defending global security. The other big flashpoint is Libya. That's an interesting story for South Africa for a couple of reasons. Ali Takuni, this gentleman, was a member of the leadership of the Arab Spring. There were a small group that met with him. I think there were maybe 8 of us who were in the room at this time. And he is running their form of CODESA. You recall in South Africa where we got all the political parties from the extreme left to the extreme right. I'm not sure Eugene and his guys were there. They weren't invited, that's right, and they drove through the World Trade Center. So they wanted to participate. But everyone else was invited. They've got the same thing there. All these different people who are together in there having their CODESA. But unlike what we had in CODESA where, you know, okay, we had Eugene driving through the front door once. They've had 6 car bombs going off in the vicinity. There are many people who don't want Libya to be stabilized. Libya is a country of 6 million people with extraordinary oil and mineral wealth. There's a lot to play for. But what he explained to us is very interesting. This fellow on that side, old handsome there, the man with a golden gun, remember him? Gaddafi, who incidentally owns the Village Walk just around the corner. And who knows how much else. Spirited out of the country $200 billion that they know of. $200 billion. That's like 3 times what Bill Gates is worth, and he's the richest man in the world. And he says, does Ali Takuni, that there's at least another $200 billion they don't know about that they're trying to find. What he has inherited, and here's another interesting point for South Africa, is the system was built on one strong man and weak institutions. Does it remind you of someone up north? They're having to try to deal with something that they inherited. He says there's nothing there. There's no army. There's no police force. Imagine trying to run a country with no army and no police force. And they're the back door to ISIS. ISIS is just around the corner. It's an Islamic state that has been created by fundamentalists, or as they call the people of Islam call them, rural Islam, where anything goes. You've seen the videos, no doubt. They almost like the Somali pirates. They'll find somebody who's worth a bit of money, take them off, and if you don't pay the ransom, they chop his head off and then send the video around so the whole world can see it. Extraordinary situation that's happening there. And unfortunately for Libya, with no army and no police force and in a prime position, people are coming through it to join ISIS. They're the back door for ISIS, he says. They're an educated people. They've got abundant wealth. They're pumping out 200,000 barrels a day of oil, whereas at the peak they were doing 1.6 million barrels a day of oil. So those of you who want to buy Sasol shares, just think when Libya stabilizes from 200 to 1.6 million, not so sure. Anyway, Libya is everybody talks about Libya as a major problem. Geopolitics in the Middle East. During the week, the king of Saudi Arabia died. We still haven't absorbed what that means for the world. Paulo Coelho, the author of The Alchemist, who's a regular visitor to Davos, I asked him about the interview. Remember the interview? Do you remember that? The North Korean skit on the North Korean leader, and then Sony pulled it off. Paulo said he'll pay them $100,000 if they sell him the rights. Well, of course, he was a little premature because they did distribute it online and made millions of dollars from it. But he says that ISIS is being supported by the media because the media are publicizing them in the wrong way. Just an interesting point, an interesting observation from a very smart guy. The other, that's the oil price. Of course, the decline in the oil price has destabilized or caused more destabilization in the Middle East. Now you wonder why geopolitics is the number one issue that happened in Davos this year. And there it is for you. Inclusive growth. He's the singularly most unimpressive leader I've ever had the misfortune of sitting in an audience with. His name is Löfven. He's the Prime Minister of Sweden. And all he's interested in at the moment is how does he get onto the UN Security Council. He came to our meeting 15 minutes late, and then a small group of editors, about 10 editors, and then started speaking Swedish. Anyway, he's what he is good at, and what the Swedes have been very good at, is getting income inequality sorted out in their country. I was so interested to hear what he had to say about that. And this was one of the first times at the meeting where a theme was recurrent theme came through, and that is gender equality. In South Africa, we're not there. We kind of get it, but we don't properly get it. Sweden, gender equality is strong, and he says their research shows that if gender equality were to be unleashed around the world, in other words, very simple, let girls get jobs that boys are getting in, and vice versa, it would add 12% to global economic growth. That's the kind of thing that appeals to business leaders. You know, what's the bottom line for it? So inclusive growth was a big story. I was commissioned this year by the Guardian of London to write a few stories. And this guy gave me a like international, well-read, 220,000 people read the story that I wrote for the Guardian. You know, in South Africa, that's like the whole internet population. Well, not quite, but his name is Robertson. And the reason that story went viral in that way was he was a former partner of George Soros. And he now runs a new economic think tank. And he says, amongst these hedge fund managers, because of inequality and because of the concerns that they're seeing, now hedge funds, remember, are there to watch the risks. Amongst the hedge fund managers, he says, many of them are buying airstrips and farms in places like New Zealand as their getaway cars. The Guardian loved that quote, and so did many other people around the world. But the reality of that means there is insecurity that is occurring in countries because of this dislocation in equality, the inequalities that exist. This lady, Helen Clark, talking about New Zealand, is the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. She now runs the United Nations' development program. I had a lovely interview with her. You can go and read it on BizNews or listen to it if you want to. And she says the UN numbers show that in the last 25 years, remember this was also the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall for Davos this year. In that period, 3/4 of the people in developing countries are worse off. Isn't that extraordinary? Because developing countries have been growing at a rate of knots. But if 3/4 of them have got lower incomes, what does that mean for the world? What does that mean for this dislocation of resources? How is it going to be addressed? I heard a lovely quote. Somebody in one of these sessions said, Martin Luther King once told the world that the arch of history is long, but it evolves to justice. I took that back and thought about it. And the whole inequality story is one where the arch of history is long, but it is evolving towards justice. And I really just want to appeal to you, coming from Davos, this is where the capitalists are. I mean, Mark explained to you. This is where they get together to make the rules. They're starting to realize, hang on, guys, we can't carry on like this. The 1%, the 80 people who own as much wealth as the 3.5 billion bottom of the pyramid people. So there we are on Earth, 7 billion people. The bottom 3.5, half the people on Earth have got the same amount of wealth of 80 people. It's a bit strange, eh? Those 80 people, of course, include Bill Gates, who gives all his money away, and the guys from Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who have been rewarded, but have given us huge productivity gains and created enormous wealth. Imagine, what do we pay for Google? Nothing. So there's been a lot of addition to the system as well. It's complex, it's difficult, but the world is trying to grapple with that. I hope you recognize her, our former deputy president, hopefully president of this country one day, Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, one of the stars of Davos. When she left here, before she didn't get on with the other faction that came in after Polokwane, as is well known. She went to the United Nations. She was offered a job as Under-Secretary and head of the gender equity drive for the UN. Big job, very big job. But before she went there, she went back to university and did her doctorate in mobile technology. She then applied what she learnt to get people of the world talking to each other in a program called He for She. He for She, after it's launched, had 1 billion people engaging online. That's our Phumzile. They like her there. They think she walks on water there. And in some ways, I think she does too. She's done some incredible things. In the session that I went along to talk to her, and there's also a really nice interview with her on Biz News. I grabbed her afterwards. I think, the fact that we come from the same country helped. I got there and maybe the other guys didn't. But in this session, she said that there is an opportunity for economic growth to be stimulated. Her view is that Africa, it'll grow by about 12% if you just allow girls the same opportunities as boys. And this is kind of twigging now in the minds of business leaders. Most especially this man from the political front, Paul Kagame from Rwanda, who incidentally, after the genocide, wrote their own constitution, like the guys are in Libya, like we did in this country. And in that constitution, they wanted to get it right, so they wrote in there that 30% of the cabinet members had to be female. 30%. It worked so well that today 64% of the parliamentarians in Rwanda are women. 2/3 almost. And Rwanda, incidentally, is growing at 7.5% a year, economic growth. Did last year. Not bad for girls. The world's changing. The world's changing around us, and we aren't really up to it yet. And sometimes when we get dragged into these changes, we should realize that they may be good for us. That's Melinda Gates from the Bill and Melinda Foundation. And she had some very good news for us. She said that she and Bill believe that because of technology, the poor people are going to have the best growth in their incomes in the next 15 years in history. Because what is wealth? How does wealth create it? It's just through opportunity. And that's what everybody was saying. Just make opportunities equal. Boys and girls, minorities, majorities, just open up the gates and watch economic growth flood. Now, this is not crazy people on the left wing talking. This is at the heart of capitalism. I have to re-emphasize that. It's one of the smartest people I've had the privilege of meeting, Dr. Kim, the managing director of the World Bank. When he arrived at the World Bank, he said he had to do a lot of restructuring. It's taken him a couple of years of doing that. And if you read through history around the world, you will see the World Bank is actually not like that much, because they used to come in like the seagulls, crap all over the people who are there and then leave. Well, they've changed that. He has, because every time he engages with political leaders, he says they don't want his money. Well, the World Bank's got plenty. They want access to his knowledge, the 2,000 PhDs that work for the World Bank. And that's what's changing. The world has become a place where knowledge is being sucked in. There's plenty of capital. We've had quantitative easing. There's lots of it to go around. But knowledge. What he said as well is that the way they used to measure this income inequality, a thing called the Gini coefficient, highest earners, lowest earners, how big is it? The bigger it is, the worse it is. He says that doesn't really work because they can't measure what the rich actually own. They've got their assets spread all over the world. He said, and anyway, that doesn't really matter, because take the Google guys. Should you begrudge them for having created Google and added the productivity they had? He said instead what they're doing at the World Bank now is they're taking the bottom 40% of a country and is their wealth growing faster than the economic growth of the country as a whole? So it's a whole new matrix, a whole new way of measuring things. And he reckons they've set themselves a target that by 2025, they will eradicate or reduce poverty from the current level of 17% of the world's population who work on $1 a day, who live on $1.25 a day, that's defined as poverty, to 3%. Now they've got something they're working towards. Interesting. I put Switzerland in there on one of the slides because in many ways it's a bit of a role model for the rest of the world. In one way, of course, the costs over there are extraordinary. They're extreme. Somebody paid 250 Rand for a hamburger. I know we had two on the train, which is not known to be a Michelin star restaurant. We had 2 cups of tea with tea bags, and that cost us 122 Rand. So it's an expensive place. But what they've got right is they have full employment, even in this time. The unemployment rate is 3.4%. The youth unemployment rate is 3.4% as well. And they explained to us, the CEO of a company called Adecco. Adecco is, it places 1 million people a day, 300,000 people in China. He explained the reason why the Swiss are so good at employing people is when you go to school in Switzerland, you go to work as well during your holidays. 2 weeks a year, you go and do some work. When you go to university, if you get into university, and they have a cap of 18% of their equivalent of matriculants, you can go. They want the rest of you to go straight into the workforce, and if you happen to go to university during your vax, you have to go and work. They call it vocational training, something that used to happen in South Africa and has kind of gone out of use here, and increasingly now is being picked up in other parts of the world. On a similar topic, the CEO of Marks & Spencer is launching something that he is now forcing through to suppliers, has been forcing through to their top 25 suppliers, and then even the 1,000 SMEs below that, where they are encouraging them to take in an intern for 1 month. We're going to try, well, I'm hoping to convince my colleagues at BizNews that we can try to do the same thing. But the point about all of this is that you give someone who can't break into the workforce 1 month of knowing what it's like to have a job. 1 month of knowing basic things that those of us who have jobs understand, like you arrive on time, appropriately attired, the way you don't eat your food at your desk, etc., etc. Things that are just, if you're not exposed to them, how do you know? These are developments that are happening in the world in reaction to the issues that we're having to deal with. Okay, so that's the inclusive growth story. Disruption, well, I made the point last night, which was when I went to Davos for the first time in 1993, I had to hire a camera team from Slovenia, a country I'd never heard of at that stage. There were 4 of them in the camera team with a big fat camera, and the poor SABC must have paid, I remember the numbers were just astronomical. This year, my wife and I went with a D70 Canon camera, which we put on a tripod. She pressed the buttons and made sure that everything worked right, and we did about 8 or 9 videos that we could put online immediately. We could have broadcast if we wanted. They were broadcast quality. Now think of the difference there in that industry, and it's not media alone. Many, many industries are being disrupted by technology. Many industries are changing. And this guy, TK Kurian, is from a company called Wipro, and Wipro employs 105,000 people, and he says his biggest challenge is that scale, i.e. bigness, which is what the world is built on in business, is becoming more and more of a problem. Because bigness doesn't give you advantage anymore. It gives you disadvantage. They're trying to, within themselves, they're trying to change things. This guy here is Vladimir Stolf. Valentin Stolf is his name. He's 29 years old. He runs a little company, at the moment, 20 staff, called Number26.eu. Number26.eu's got 100 million in funding, euros that is. They want to be the first European bank, only mobile. Now, I know some banks in this country have done quite well. You go to Capitec, maybe it takes you an hour to open an account, maybe 2. I'm not sure what Standard Bank's timing is. If you go, you pick up your phone and you put on Number26.eu, you open your account, mobile only, in 8 minutes. He says the reason they've done this is because his generation go into a branch of a bank once a year. They do online banking once a week through their desktops. They do banking on their mobiles every day. He said, how obvious. Why don't we give them a bank that they want to use? Disruption. 20 people. A guy called Keith Weed made the point, and this is one that kind of stuck with me. He is the chief marketing officer at Unilever. On the day that Kodak filed for bankruptcy, Facebook bought Instagram, which is the digital version of Kodak, of the Polaroid. Isn't that interesting? These changes are extraordinary. Just one last point on that. There was a young girl in the United States who didn't like a particular ingredient that was being put into soft drinks. So she wrote to the company and she asked them to take the ingredient out. And you can imagine that the response to her was what you would expect any big company to respond to a young girl who said, take an ingredient out of your soft drink. So she started a website. And on that website, she had a petition. And she got 200,000 people to sign the petition. That soft drink company took the ingredient out of the product. Now think of that happening in the world we come from. Here is a lady that was described by Dr. Kim of the World Bank as a gift to the world, Christine Lagarde. She runs the International Monetary Fund. Once again, she was very influential in Davos. But I put her up there because her quote is probably the quote of the whole 5 days. She says, the world no longer, or countries who have been subsidizing local fuel prices no longer have to do it. They've been spending $2 trillion a year, crazy numbers, in subsidizing it. How about giving $1 trillion back to the people? Because with the oil price lower, you don't have to subsidize anymore, but taking the other $1 trillion and putting it into education. And while you're at it, put it into education of the girls. Interesting. These are the things that are happening. Europe, sure, I wish I had so much more time because there is so much interesting stuff here, but that's South Africa's future. A country called Italy. For the last 20 years, Italy has had zero growth, not GDP growth, for 20 years. Now, how do you run a country if you get no economic growth? Well, your debt goes up. Italy's debt, national debt, is up threefold. Why? This is the new president or prime minister of Italy. His name is Matteo Renzi. Go read about him. Google him. He's a socialist. He says the reason why is we have inflexible labor laws. Hello. Sound familiar? 20 years of, get that wrong. It's terrible to exaggerate. 20 years of no growth, 3 times the debt. He knows he's not going to be re-elected, but they've managed to change the constitution, not the political laws, so that at least, Italy used to have a different prime minister every week. Now they've changed it so he can carry on for 4 years. He says he'll never keep his job, but in those 4 years, he's going to change the labor market, free up the labor market so that when you hire, you can fire. The United States has been telling us this forever. We are now seeing Europe picking up on it. This gentleman is Alexander Stubb. He's the prime minister. By the way, he's 40 years old. Matteo Renzi. So is he. And we saw the new guy from Greece looks about 40. What's happening? Why are these youngsters now being promoted to the leading positions in politics in Europe? It's because the old guys have lost all ideas. They don't know what to do. Europe's in a bad way. This is Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, who brought through quantitative easing. Quantitative easing now in Europe is kicking in the same way as they had it in America. The problem that he's got is he can throw money at the problem, but the structure has to change underneath. Now, Renzi's changing the structure. The Greeks, as we heard, are not that keen. So we'll see what happens. But it's breathing space. That's all QE gives you. QE gives you breathing space for a period of time. In America, they didn't have to change their structure. They've got a very flexible labor market, a very flexible economy. Europe is still in the balance. Those of you who follow the global portfolio on BizNews will know that we are fully invested in the United States. In fact, that our ETF that we've invested in is the S&P 500, and that's because of the US. It's out of quantitative easing. The Americans are confident again. They are moving. The economy grew on an annualized growth rate of 5% in the last quarter. They're on their way. And it was also shown in Davos as well. The Americans are not stepping back for anyone. They have their issues, but economic growth is not one of them. China also, the Prime Minister of China was in Davos this year, a man who is highly regarded by pretty much everybody there. Anyone in the economic world respects China in the same way as they disrespect these two people on the BRICS. This is Dilma Rousseff. She didn't make the trip this year. Not surprising, because Petrobras, the company that she chaired, for a period of about 9 years, is locked in one of the greatest scandals that's hit the world. Tens of billions of dollars were siphoned out of Petrobras, the state-owned company in Brazil, and quite a lot of it found its way into the coffers of her political party. Next to her is the polecat of the world. Those of you who are of my age will remember that during apartheid South Africa, when we traveled, and somebody asked, where are you from? You said, Australia, New Zealand, England. England. You certainly didn't admit that you came from South Africa. I guess the Russians are going through the same thing at the moment. And these two guys, Modi, and the Prime Minister, Modi is from India, and the Prime Minister of China are the Mr.'s popular at the moment. India is doing amazing reforms, changes to that country. If you have money invested or are thinking about it, this is one place where you can be really, really looking more carefully now. They're starting to tackle it primarily because Modi has a track record of reform. His state, the Gujarat state, had they rated that independently, this was Dr. Kim told us this from the World Bank, on the World Bank's ease of doing business, they would have come in at 50th, whereas India as a whole is 169. So Modi is now implementing what he did at his state to the whole of India. Watch this space. South Africa, that tells it all, doesn't it? Our leader, our president, was wrapped in cotton wool. I wrote a piece for City Press last week. If you go online, you can pick it up. He was invisible, which is very sad because I recall in 2009 he arrived there at a time just after Polokwane and people were giving him a hard time, and he said, look, I'm here to learn and to listen. Well, we never saw him this time. He managed to have 2 meetings which were trumpeted back in South Africa with the heads of state of the Netherlands and New Zealand, those global powers. Shame. I was invited to a dinner for 30 with the president. When I arrived there was no president and there were 200 people. People from Brand South Africa were very excited at the number of people who arrived. I'm not so sure they'll be coming next year. But one of the good things was that I managed to sit opposite. I got lucky and was placed opposite the new finance minister, who is extremely impressive. Nhlanhla Nene is not going to be the most popular man later in about a month's time when he presents the budget in February, because they've got a hole to fill. It's not his fault, but he's a humble man. He listens. He's again another in the mold of the Treasury just keeps producing really good finance ministers in South Africa, and I think he's going to go down as one of the best of them. When we were talking about various issues, I did manage earlier in the day to talk to a chap called Arnie Sorensen. I interviewed him on CNBC. He's the head of Marriott. Marriott paid a couple of billion rand for a group here called Protea Hotels. Arnie Sorensen said he's not so sure he would do it again. Reason is, we've changed the visas in South Africa. So foreign tourists from the area that Protea relied heavily on, China, have fallen off a cliff. He said Chinese tourism is down 70% as a consequence of the visas, because if you're from China and you want to come to South Africa, now you have to go to the embassy in Beijing. China's a big country, a really big country. And the embassy in Beijing is quite full. As you can see, other business leaders, there's Sim Shabalala from Standard Bank. And just to kind of get towards the end there, he really is, Putin is the polecat of the world at the moment. The way he's operated in Ukraine, the Ukrainian president said to us, because he has to deal with Putin to try and find some settlement, he says he doesn't know who he's talking to day. He phones him up the one day and he says the guy is reasonable. The next day, he's a different person. His view is that nobody in the world understands Putin. But what he did say that stuck with me, that is a good lesson for South Africa, he says the Russians are rule makers, not rule takers. Remember, Ukraine was part of Russia for the last 300 years. And if we think we're going to do a nice deal, a nice sweetheart deal here in South Africa on nuclear power with the Russians, it might be worth remembering that insight. The impact on South Africa. So first of all, Africa. I mean, every year I come here and I tell you good news about Africa. Africa was nowhere this year. Nowhere in the public eye. The Nigerians had an election, no Nigerian heads of state. There were a couple of, Alika Dangote was there, and I think Wally from Owando, but there were a few Nigerians to be seen scattered all over the place, but none of their politicians. So they weren't on the global stage. South Africa, falling down the pecking order, because we just aren't that important. Remember, we're 0.3% of global GDP. We punch above our weight, and many years at the WEF we've been right in the spotlights. But this year, it wasn't really a year for South Africa in the headlines. However, when I did speak to business people about Africa, there is as much excitement today as there was last year and the year before and so on. And all you have to do, next time you're in Sandton, is just open your eyes and you'll realize why. You've got a big building going up for ENS, for Weber Wenzel. Ernst & Young have got one. Grant Thornton are building a big one. Services companies are booming in this country, especially those who are servicing Africa. Because now the talk is over, now the money is actually coming in. So the Africa story is not in headlights anymore, but the smart money is onto it. The impact on South Africa, well, quite good news here is that inclusive growth is something that we've tried to tackle, and we still are tackling. We just need our population to kind of get that it's not just us, and it's not something we have to do, but it's good business sense. It is the next big challenge identified in Davos, and clearly it's a big challenge here in South Africa. Laura Tyson, who is in this, also had a lovely interview. I had some really good interviews this year, but you can go and read this or listen to it on Biz News. She's from Berkeley, University of California. She said that since the global financial crisis, the world's done a lot good, but the one thing we haven't tackled is inequalities, and that's kind of the next big challenge. The economic outlook for South Africa, the last slide. Rob Davies and Ibrahim Patel, I've boxed with both of them, not physically but metaphorically, on the CNBC show. They could not have been friendlier. So as much as Jay-Z was remote, I think perhaps they just kept him in cotton wool because, you know, who wants to let Nkandla start? How do you defend something like that? It's the world press, and they wouldn't hold back. But these guys they gave me the impression, and it is only an impression, I don't have anything in black and white, that we are looking again for solutions in South Africa, rather than saying we have all the solutions to the problems. The business leaders from South Africa that I spoke to said that they engaged with these two gents who drive the economic agenda in the cabinet, and they said they couldn't believe it was the same people that they were dealing with before. Approachable, listening, how do we work together, how do we pull this wagon out of the mud, and I find that very heartening. I was a Boy Scout in my youth, one of the things I'm very proud of. I'm also on the board of Scouts South Africa. And what do the Scouts teach you? They teach you to be observant. What do journalism teaches you to be observant. And those observations often are a little bit of a highlight of what's coming. We know we've got lots to do in this country. We know we have many challenges. But it's nice to know that those who make the decisions are no longer of the opinion that they have all the answers. In fact, in this interview with Ibrahim, who's the Minister of Economic Development, he said, we've done very well in the last 20 years, but we still haven't found our growth path yet. Isn't that different from what you've heard in the past? The JSE, once again, #1 in the world. Isn't that great? 5 years in a row for regulation. So all of you are investors through the Standard Bank. There's no other exchange in the world that you can feel safer on in making your investments, which is a good thing. And our team put that picture there, and I love it. Because I left Davos and came home and thought, you know, the good Lord has blessed me to live here. We're far, far away from the chaos that is now a very, very real part of people who live in those areas. And it is difficult. when mankind and the human beings who are leaders of these countries divert their attention from collective problems to individual problems, they get driven by very different motives. We in South Africa are still working on those collective problems, as we know. The world's a dangerous place for investors, for people. But if you're going to live it or see out this dangerous period, and hopefully it all does work out, and it usually does. We usually muddle through as a species. We haven't wiped ourselves out yet. Then there can be few places better than right here, right now. Thank you. We have got a couple of minutes for, about 10 minutes for questions. So is there anybody who would like to challenge, ask? Don't be shy. Guys in Durban, hey, they couldn't stop, eh? They were asking me all about this KZN. Sir?
What do you feel the negative impact of ISIS is on the world economy?
Yo, that question was, what do you feel the negative impact of ISIS is on the world economy? It's impossible to calculate. It's impossible to calculate. ISIS has now got 8 million people who are in that caliphate. They are getting people in through the back door through Libya. It's scary. One doesn't know where it's going to go to. What we do know is that the world's aware of it. And that's about the only upside at this point. And Turkey, the Turkish Prime Minister came to see us in our little group. And he believes that ISIS cannot be eradicated without first getting rid of Assad from Syria. And Assad, as you know, they're trying to do deals with Assad now. And his reasoning on that, and this is the people who borders his country. I mean, imagine all of a sudden out of nowhere, half of Namibia was taken over by a bunch of guys who kidnap people and chop their heads off and put it onto videos. I mean, it's really an issue, and particularly for Turkey. But he says that the Turkish believe that Assad has killed, or they calculate has killed 250,000 people. How can you deal with a person like that? But it appears that global politics is finding a different way, or trying to find a different way. The only good news is people are aware of it. The only thing about Iran was that last year the president, if you were in this thing, last year the president was there, and he actually had an interesting meeting with us. I asked him about MTN, and he kind of dodged the question. He said, MT who? This year the foreign minister was there. So they are engaging. They are trying to, as much as possible, to become part of the West. Good point, though. If Iran normalizes, you have another Saudi Arabia supplying oil. Think of it that way. If Iraq, and the Prime Minister of Iraq was at Davos, first time in 23 years, if they normalize, you have yet another Saudi Arabia supplying oil. So people buying Sasol today are really trying to catch a falling knife. I think there's a realization. It's almost like apple pie and motherhood. Jobs are created by small businesses. The world is no longer a friendly place for big businesses. There's a lot of disruption going on. How do you offset the robotics coming in and taking people out? You know, think about manufacturing. Manufacturing processes today mean you can do the same with a plant with 100 people that you'd need 1,000 people in the past for. So it's kind of there. It's understood. It's part of the process. And there's a lot of support there's a realization that you're not going to get economic growth without supporting the SME sector. So there's entrepreneur. Last year, actually, it wasn't this year so much, but last year there was a very good speech by the president of South Korea, a dainty little lady called Park. South Korea, I suppose. Many of them, it's like Smith, I suppose, here. And she was saying how they realized in South Korea that they needed to really support entrepreneurship. One of the things that they did was they changed the banking regulations so that if you were an entrepreneur and you went bankrupt, generally speaking, you would get a terrible credit rating. But as long as you weren't dishonest, you had your credit rating reinstated, which gave you the ability for access to capital. But the world is swinging in that way, most definitely. Yeah, poor old Eskom. It's like what years ago. I come from KZN, and we have a rugby team there that was in the B division of the Currie Cup, and it was everybody's kicking boy. Oh, from Natal. When are you guys going to learn how to play rugby? Well, poor Eskom. Everything we blame on Eskom. Remember, Eskom pleaded with government for a period of years and said, we are going to run out of electricity. Please let us build these new plants. And the government of the time said no. Now to blame Eskom for something that is not of their making is a little bit harsh. But what those three guys have learnt, it was critical that they went. It wasn't even I think there was a bit of power play going on from what I heard behind the scenes. It was almost like, you stay at home and fix up the problem. And, hang on, you've appointed a guy as chairman who knows about as much about electricity as I do, and that's dangerous. You've appointed a guy as CEO who knows probably a little bit more, maybe slightly more than I do about electricity, and I certainly would not even get close to thinking that I could run the place. Would they have learnt by being exposed to the best minds in the world in their fields? Unquestionably. It's all about knowledge. Remember what Dr. Kim said. They come to me at the World Bank and they say, I'd work with people, he says, with political leaders who want to work with me. I work with India. I work with Mexico. Because they want to tap into our knowledge. Those who think they know it all, well, try and find someone in the administration that we can work with. I didn't pose the question. But when it comes to Eskom, it was a travesty that they bowed to ignorance of media pressure. I think that's really what it was.
What's the question?
Jacob Zuma's been going to Davos since 2009. Has any of the magic rubbed off on him? 1992. Nelson Mandela was getting the government in waiting ready to nationalize everything that moved in this country. I recall having an interview on SABC, who I worked for at the time, with Tito Mboweni, who was to be appointed Labour Minister, who said, when we come to power in 18 months' time, rest assured that ISCOR will be renationalized, Sasol will be renationalized, etc. Now, Madiba went to Davos, January 1992. He shared a platform for the first time anywhere publicly with F.W. de Klerk and Mangosuthu Buthelezi. He spoke the nationalizing story, and people kind of grumbled. They, in fact, told him to stop because he'd overstayed his limit of time. He was then pounced upon by every Western leader you could imagine to tell him why he was wrong. And he remained resolute until he met with the Prime Minister of Vietnam, a former Viet Cong general who he had admired during his time at Robben Island. And this former Viet Cong general said to our Madiba, you've got it wrong. We tried this way, but the best way to uplift our people is to understand global capitalism, to apply capitalism in a way that creates wealth, and by creating wealth, our people get uplifted. Jacob Zuma, when he arrived there the first year, he had no burden of office. He was able to go to sessions, and I saw him in sessions. He was able to engage with others on a humble, and he, those days, he really was a very quiet, humble, interesting man, introspective, a man capable of reflection. Things have happened since. Who knows what goes on in the man's mind today? But today, this year in Davos, I doubt that he had any of the magic sprinkled on him, because he just didn't have the opportunity. Sad, but those are the realities of the world we live in. The question was about India, and about labor rates in India, and about infrastructure. Have you visited India?
Pardon?
Have you visited India?
Not yet.
India is a country which desperately needs infrastructure. I mean, really, those of you who've been there will know what I'm talking about. It's chaotic. You think our taxi drivers are bad. Whoosh. But there the guys are, they're just more chilled. I don't know if they've got some leaves that they chew or something. But no, you don't see too many accidents in India. But India's infrastructure is a massive challenge. Remember, this is a country that in the late 40s, 1940s, got its independence from being a former colony and chose the socialist route and shot both of its feet off for the next 50 years by applying the worst of colonialism and the worst of Marxism, and just went nowhere. India is a country of massive poverty. When you walk around Mumbai, and those of you who've been there will know what I'm talking about. Here at least we have shacks. There, your home, or for many, many people, is a strip on the pavement for tonight. So India has got challenges we don't even know where to start thinking about. When you've got over 1 billion people in that area, and against 50 million. Now 50 million, it's manageable in South Africa. We sometimes forget we've got manageable issues. Imagine trying to get 1 billion people. There they want to sterilize people so they don't have children. It's just it's big challenges, but they have leadership. And that can often be the difference for any country. And certainly what came out of the World Economic Forum this year is they have leadership and they're focusing on the right things. Labor rates in India, when you're sitting with, 200, 300 million unemployed people, as you do in China, there's going to be pressure on labor rates indefinitely, but to keep them down. But the beauty about the Chinese system is once you're in, there's so much competition for you that you get plucked out quite quickly. So you might start low, but you can get in the game. And sometimes we forget this in South Africa. Give a person a chance to get in the game. That's why this vocational training. Get someone in, maybe as an intern for a month. Just let them get in the game. Then you can thrive. But we've kind of gone the Italian route, where we say, no, those who are in the game are going to stay, and those who aren't, well, tough luck. You can't make it. India is a little on the labor side like Ethiopia. Ethiopia, 110 million people, not many natural resources, clever people. I mean, they're an amazing culture in Ethiopia. It's been going for centuries, thousands of years. And what they decided to do was to use the people's opportunity to get in the game. So they pulled in a lot of textiles companies and at low labor rates. But the good thing about that is if you start at a low rate, you can then show what you're worth. And very quickly you move up the ladder. Infrastructure is a big challenge in India. I think but everyone's behind them. Remember, we've got the BRICS Bank on the one hand and the World Bank, and they're working very closely with the World Bank. And they've got a good leader. So maybe that's where the magic's going to happen. Yeah, it's a global issue. Capital is available to those. I mean, what is a bank? A bank says, here's your umbrella when the sun is shining, and I'll take it away when the rain starts. So we know that. But it's not a South African, and that's the one thing that I can say to you is what Davos taught me again, and keeps reminding me. It's not a South African function. It's not unique to us.
No, I understand that, but if you look at quantitative easing, where does the money, how far does the money trickle down?
When you look at businesses, people who start businesses, I've started 2 businesses. Successful. We've done in 17 months at BizNews what we did in 17 years at MoneyWeb. Where did I go and ask for capital? I borrowed it where I could, by putting up my house, by taking risk, by selling my wife's flat, by finding ourselves. I didn't go to some bank and say, oh, I've got this great business plan, give me the money. Because no bank is going to do that. The reality is that the banks, they'll give you the umbrella when the sun is shining. And when the sun is shining, they might even, because they also have, remember, limited capital resources. We've got to get away from this. People start businesses by going to people they know. They ask friends, family, come, beg, steal, borrow, whatever we can put, and they start small. Too often, sometimes, we want to change the world overnight. When I look at the great success stories, did Zuckerberg ask anyone for money? Did the Google guys ask anyone for money? They started it in a way that was functional. We've got to get away from that. The banks come into the equation just before the listing comes into the equation. I remember in 2009, I remember talking to, I'm getting old, 1997. Those of you who were around then will remember there was an IT boom in South Africa. And I recall one of the guys from an IT company saying to me in this group of 20 IT CEOs who were being listed, saying to me that the reason he's listing is because he can't get money from the bank. Now, that's a different time, a different era. But entrepreneurs will look for capital where they can, and most of that capital will be sweat equity. So I don't know. As I say, we're missing each other on this one. When you get big, then you go to the banks, and then they'll help you out. But I wouldn't rely on it in the short term. He'll bring plenty back. He'll bring plenty back. You can just, you see people whose minds are open and receptive, and that's what I saw. I saw a man who was Jacob Zuma in 2009. I saw a man who came to listen and to learn. So he's smart, eh? And remember, they've got great networks there, because they will meet, say, the finance minister of Kenya, who might be doing something good in the IT space, and they'll meet the finance minister of Slovenia, I'm sure it still exists, but he might have something clever that he's doing as well. So it's also a networking thing. It's very lonely at the top, and this is a way in Davos for them to engage. We're getting it back in chunks, because Nigeria has got all the bad press in the world, Boko Haram. I mean, if you were sitting in New York, would you go to a country where they kidnap girls and turn them into wives for freedom fighters or whatever they call themselves? No, the smart money's here. And you just have to open your eyes. You can see it. It's coming through Sandton. Look around the Gautrain. Things are happening in this country below the radar that we don't kind of get because we don't look for it. We read the headlines and sometimes get a little bit distracted. But the money is going into Africa. The smart money is still going in. In fact, you think about things and then you make the decisions, and some years later it occurs. So don't despair. They did, and I didn't get to those sessions. There are 250 different sessions, and particularly on space and the one I told you about Bertrand Piccard with his solar-powered aeroplane. But there are 250 sessions, and clearly you can't get to all of them. In fact, you can only get to a fraction. And if you and I went there together next year, you might come back with a very different view to the one that I come back from, depending on which sessions you get to. But generally speaking, science is becoming more involved in economics. The old days of somebody who could talk a good game, as in the United States, business has been science for many years. That's why they kind of have all these dominant multinational corporations. In many other parts of the world, as long as you spoke the right talk, lingo, you could kind of get by. Now, with technology and with the growth of science, it's the scientists who are starting to rule the world. So if you're a scientist, you're in a good place. No. Go short the rand, huh? No. I mean, that's a poor comment to make. But rationality tells us that it's likely that he's going to have to raise taxes. It now appears with a drop in the oil price, he won't have to raise that. So he won't be too unpopular. But there's a hole. I think the number I saw was 45 billion in the next 3 years that needs to be gotten from somewhere. Now, they can save a bit of money on part of it, but we have to raise money for the rest. So that means higher taxes. So, okay, one last.
Yeah, will the increase in VAT not in the long term be more beneficial?
It may be, but COSATU doesn't want to increase VAT, and COSATU doesn't want e-tolls, and COSATU doesn't want certain things. And in this country, we are a young democracy, and when COSATU doesn't want things, tends to get it right usually, because we still haven't got to the stage yet where we make decisions based on logic rather than emotion, and VAT is hugely emotive. It's not one of the, I think it's like a last resort. It's of course a smarter way of doing things, but to implement VAT into the South African socio-economic pool as it currently stands would be very difficult. Thank you for coming out in record numbers. It's lovely to see you, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.